This chapter introduces Samuel Johnson, a black farmer whose land carries generations of blood, sweat, and history. We see his life, his bond with the soil, and the legacy he protects with pride. But beneath the surface, the local HOA begins to watch him with quiet disapproval, setting the stage for conflict that will soon test his strength. Samuel Johnson woke up before the sun, as he always did, with the rhythm of a man tied not to clocks but to the earth. The rooster crowed faintly in the distance, though Samuel was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, pulling on the same worn boots that had carried him across those fields countless times. His home was modest, built decades ago by his father, with creaking wooden floors and walls lined with framed photographs of people who had come before him, his grandparents, his parents, cousins, and uncles, all of whom had, in one way or another, worked the same soil he now called his own. As he stepped outside, the morning air carried a cool crispness that filled his lungs. The smell of damp earth and cut grass wrapped around him like an old blanket. Samuel's farm stretched out before him, acres of green bordered by a simple wooden fence, with an old barn standing stubbornly at the far edge. The barn leaned slightly, weathered by storms and seasons, but it held a strength that only time could forge. Just like Samuel himself, the land was more than property. It was memory. His grandfather had fought to purchase it at a time when black families were systematically denied ownership. His father had defended it fiercely, refusing to sell even when developers came waving offers that would have made other men rich. And now, it was Samuel's turn to protect it. Every furrow in the soil, every tree that shaded the fields, carried stories of struggle and triumph. Samuel bent down, scooping up a handful of dark earth, letting it crumble through his fingers. Still strong, he murmured to himself. It was a habit of his, talking the soil as if it were alive, because, in a way, it was. His ancestors had poured their labor into it, and their sweat still lingered in the roots of the crops he grew. He walked across the fields, his dog Rusty trotting faithfully beside him. The corn had begun to sprout tall, catching the faint light of dawn, while rows of vegetables lay in neat lines, cared for with the kind of precision Samuel had inherited from his father. Farming wasn't just work. It was ritual. Each seed planted was a promise, each harvest a fulfillment. Yet even in this peace, Samuel could feel the subtle weight of eyes watching. Beyond the edge of his property stretched the neighborhood, rows of newly built houses, identical in their neatness, each one painted in HOA-approved shades of beige, white, or gray. Lawns were trimmed to exact lengths, hedges sculpted like works of art, and driveways washed until they gleamed. It was a neighborhood obsessed with appearances, and Samuel's farm was the one place that didn't fit the mold. To Samuel, this was no problem. He didn't care if his barn's paint faded in the sun, or if his tractor left dust on the road. His land was authentic, living, breathing. But to the Homeowners Association, the HOA, his farm was a constant reminder that someone dared to live outside their grip. He had already seen the disapproving glances at the grocery store, the way a couple of board members whispered when he walked past them in town. Even the letters that sometimes arrived in his mailbox, thinly veiled reminders about property upkeep and suggestions about appearances. Samuel chuckled at those letters. They couldn't tell him what color his barn should be. They couldn't dictate what crops he planted. Or so he thought. One Sunday afternoon, while Samuel was fixing a broken gate, a man in a polo shirt and khakis walked up. He introduced himself as Mark, the HOA president. Mark's smile was polished, but his tone carried the kind of sharpness that cut beneath the surface. "Mr. Johnson, we've had some concerns about your property," Mark said, his eyes sweeping over fields as though he were inspecting them for flaws. "The community prides itself on uniformity. It helps keep property values high." Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against the fence. "This land's been here long before your community," he replied calmly. "And it'll be here long after those property values you talk about." Mark's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered. "We're just asking for cooperation. Everyone else follows the rules. You should too." Samuel didn't respond. He just looked out over his fields, then back at Mark. The silence was louder than any words. Finally, Mark muttered something about discussions at the next meeting and walked off, his shoes too clean for the dusty road. That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter the HOA had left in his mailbox earlier that week. It demanded that he repaint his barn, trim his hedges, and reduce the height of his fencing. He laughed bitterly, tossing the paper aside. His barn was painted by his father's hands. His fence had stood tall since he was a boy. And as far as Samuel was concerned, no committee of strangers could rewrite his family's history. Still, beneath his quiet defiance, Samuel felt a shift. It was subtle, like a shadow moving across the sun, but it was there. The HOA wasn't going away. They were watching him, waiting for him to bend. And Samuel, though proud and unyielding, knew this was only the beginning of something larger. As the night settled in, he stepped out onto his porch, Rusty lying at his feet. The cicadas hummed in the fields, and the stars blinked softly above. Samuel rocked slowly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the land that stretched before him. He thought of his father's words. "This soil is our inheritance, Sam. Protect it, no matter the cost." The HOA might see his farm as an obstacle to their perfect image, but Samuel knew better. This land was his bloodline, his anchor, his pride. And if they tried to take it from him, they would learn just how deep the roots of the Johnson family truly ran. Samuel sat on his porch long after the stars had taken their places across the darkened sky. The creak of the rocking chair beneath him was steady, a rhythm that matched the beating of his thoughts. He had always been a man of patience, a man who believed that storms passed and roots endured. But now he could feel the air thickening, like the moments before thunder. The HOA's presence wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was an encroaching shadow. The next morning, Samuel woke with the same routine. He fed Rusty, checked the barn, and inspected the young corn sprouting in neat green rows. The work kept his mind steady. Yet even as he poured his focus into the soil, his eyes wandered toward the cluster of houses at the edge of his fields. People stood in driveways, chatting with coffee mugs in hand. Their eyes flicked to his farm, then back to each other. The glances were quick, but Samuel noticed. He always noticed. Later that week, a white envelope appeared in his mailbox. He pulled it out, unfolded the paper, and skimmed the bolded words. Notice of violation. His barn's paint had been deemed non-compliant, with a neighborhood's approved palette. The letter ordered him to repaint within 30 days. Samuel exhaled sharply through his nose and placed the letter on the kitchen counter with the rest. The pile was growing. By Friday, another notice arrived, this one about his fencing. "Exceeds height restrictions," it read, citing bylaws Samuel had never agreed to. He shook his head, muttering. This fence stood before half those houses even existed. He tossed the paper into the drawer and carried on. But the notices didn't stop. Every week brought another letter. About grass length, about machinery left in view, about tractor noise during early hours. Each one was more absurd than the last. It was harassment disguised as bureaucracy, and Samuel felt the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. On Sunday, he went into town for supplies. The local diner was bustling, the smell of fried bacon and coffee filling the air. Samuel slid into a booth, nodding to a couple of familiar faces. But he could feel it. Conversations shifted when he walked in. A table of young couples leaned closer, their words low but sharp. "I don't know why he insists on keeping that old farm. It drags everything down. Someone needs to do something before it ruins property values." Samuel kept his expression neutral, focusing on his meal, but his jaw tightened. He'd lived long enough to know the sting of words spoken behind one's back. The difference now was that these whispers weren't just idle gossip. They were sharpening into something more pointed. Back at home, the tension was becoming undeniable. At dusk, Samuel would often find himself watching the neighborhood more closely. Once, he spotted 3 HOA members standing near the corner lot, clipboard in hand. Their voices carried faintly on the breeze. He caught fragments: land value, non-compliance, long-term solution. When they noticed him looking, they quickly dispersed, their smiles stretched thin. That night Martha, his elderly neighbor, paid him a visit. She carried a pie, as she often did, but her face was troubled. She set the pie down on his table and sighed. "Sam, I need to tell you something," she began. "I went to the HOA meeting last week. I wasn't planning to, but I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. They talked about you, about your land. Samuel leaned back, his brow furrowing. What do they say? They're not just concerned about fences or barns anymore. They're saying your property is out of place. Some of them think the association would be better off managing it themselves. A few even mentioned selling it. For a moment, Samuel sat in silence, the words striking him like a stone dropped into still water. Selling it? His fists tightened on the arms of his chair. They can't sell what isn't theirs, he said firmly. Martha reached across the table, her weathered hand resting on his. I know, Sam, but they're determined. I've lived in this neighborhood long enough to recognize that look in their eyes. They don't like being told no. After she left, Samuel walked the fields alone. Rusty padded beside him, his ears twitching at every sound. The moon was high, casting silver light over the rows of crops. Samuel stopped by the apple trees his grandfather planted, pressing his hand against the bark. The thought of losing this land was unthinkable. It wasn't just soil, it was legacy. But the whispers were growing louder. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. Samuel ignored them, but their persistence gnawed at him. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now looked away or offered curt nods. At the general store, he overheard two men discussing property values again, their words dripping with contempt. He should just sell. This isn't the 1800s. Farms don't belong in neighborhoods like this. Wouldn't surprise me if the board finds a way to push him out. Samuel gritted his teeth, but said nothing. Confrontation wasn't his way. Not yet. He knew better than to show his anger too soon. Still, each word, each glance, each letter built pressure like steam in a kettle. One evening, as Samuel repaired a broken hinge on the barn door, his cousin Elijah stopped by. Elijah was younger, fiery, with a sharp tongue and little patience for injustice. He listened as Samuel explained the situation, his face tightening with every word. They're setting you up, Sam, Elijah said. First the warnings, then the gossip, then the pressure. Next thing you know, they'll try something bigger. Samuel nodded slowly. I know, but this land isn't leaving my hands. Not now, not ever. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes burning. Then you better be ready, cousin, because they're coming for it. I can feel it. The two men stood together in silence, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The sky burned orange and red, as if foreshadowing the fire that was soon to sweep across Samuel's quiet life. The farm was still, but Samuel knew peace was slipping away. The whispers of the neighborhood were no longer harmless. They were the drumbeats of a storm gathering on the horizon, and though Samuel held himself tall, rooted like the trees his grandfather planted, he understood something he hadn't wanted to admit before. The HOA wasn't finished. They were just getting started. The HOA board members had grown comfortable with their sense of control, but Samuel Johnson's quiet resilience disturbed that comfort. To them, he was a man who had no right to resist the structure they tried to enforce, and his independence only made them resent him more. They saw him as a reminder that they could not completely dominate every inch of the neighborhood. His land stood as a barrier, an unyielding, stubborn symbol of resistance against their unspoken authority. It was during one of their routine monthly gatherings, held not in the open clubhouse, but in a member's lavish living room, that the whispers finally took shape. The room smelled faintly of leather couches and freshly brewed coffee, and the conversation, which began with budget concerns and landscaping complaints, soon veered toward Samuel. A silence hung in the air before one of the members, Mr. Cartwright, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Why should he get away with ignoring our notices? He said, his tone edged with bitterness. Everyone else complies. Everyone else bends when we set the rules. But not him. He acts like this land makes him untouchable. The others nodded. Mrs. Ellison, whose property bordered part of Samuel's land, gave a small huff of annoyance. That farm is an eyesore compared to the rest of our neighborhood. We've spent years cultivating a certain image here. His old fencing, his crops, the noise from his tractors. It doesn't belong. Though her words carried a veneer concern for appearances, what truly gnawed at her was envy. Samuel's land was expansive compared to her trim backyard, and she hated the way people in town respected him more than they respected the HOA board. Mr. Cartwright tapped his finger against the wooden armrest of his chair. It's not just about appearances. That land is worth money. Real money. And he's letting it sit there like some relic from the past. Imagine what we could do with it. Expand, sell plots, increase property values. We're wasting an opportunity. The others fell silent, letting the idea settle. For the first time, their disdain had found a profitable direction. They no longer saw Samuel's independence as just a nuisance. It was now an obstacle in the way of something they wanted. That night, the HOA leader spoke in half-sentences and subtle nods. Greed, once unspoken, now coursed through the group like a quiet current. They left the meeting with a new understanding. Samuel Johnson's land was no longer his in their eyes. It was a prize, and they had to find a way to claim it. The first step in their scheme was to learn the weaknesses in Samuel's defenses. They began by combing through public records, sending one of their own, Mr. Hastings, a retired lawyer, to dig into property deeds and zoning laws. Hastings prided himself on finding loopholes where others saw walls, and within days he had collected every document connected to Samuel's farm. He returned to the board with a thick folder, dropping it onto the polished oak table during their next meeting. "The land's been in his family for generations," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The deed is strong, airtight, really. But," he paused, letting the word dangle long enough to hook their attention, "there are ways to create pressure. If we can argue noncompliance, unpaid fines, code violations, we can build a case. Once enough penalties pile up, the land could become legally vulnerable." Mrs. Ellison's lips curled into a thin smile. "So you're saying we can choke him with his own stubbornness?" Hastings nodded. "Exactly. He thinks he's untouchable, but nobody is untouchable. Not when the law bends for those who know how to use it." Their conversations grew darker after that. What began as irritation evolved into strategy, then into a calculated plot. They talked in hushed voices, behind closed curtains, never daring to put too much in writing. Every meeting carried an undercurrent of secrecy, as though they all knew the gravity of what they were about to attempt. But the greed inside them drowned out any trace of hesitation. Outside of their hidden gatherings, the board members carried on with their lives as if nothing had changed. At community events, they smiled and shook hands. At neighborhood barbecues, they laughed and passed plates of food. But behind those smiles lay the knowledge of what they were orchestrating. Samuel remained unaware of the storm brewing around him. He noticed more letters from the HOA, small fines for supposed violations, grass an inch too tall, fencing not aesthetically aligned with community standards, equipment left unsightly near the barn. Each notice irritated him, but he brushed them aside, refusing to be rattled by their pettiness. What he didn't realize was that these were not random. They were deliberate building blocks in the HOA's larger design. One late evening, as the board gathered again in Mr. Cartwright's den, the conversation turned sharper. "We'll need a buyer lined up," Cartwright said. "It won't do to seize the land without a plan for it. Developers are hungry. I know a few who'd pay handsomely for farmland this close to town." Hastings raised a cautionary hand. "We can't rush. First, we tighten the screws. We make him sweat. By the time he realizes what's happening, the deal will already be in motion." They leaned in closer, each word stitched with arrogance. They spoke not just as neighbors, but as predators circling prey. In their eyes, Samuel was no longer a man tending to his heritage. He was an obstacle standing in the way of their profits. The plot thickened when Mrs. Ellison suggested they frame their efforts in noble terms. "We can position this as a community improvement," she said with rehearsed sweetness. "Say it's about safety, modernizing the area, raising property values. People will support us if we make it sound like progress." Her words dripped with hypocrisy, yet the board members nodded. They knew public image mattered, and masking greed behind a language of progress made them feel justified. By the end of the meeting, the HOA leaders had crossed an invisible line. What had once been idle talk was now a carefully laid scheme. They had convinced themselves that Samuel was unreasonable, that his history and family roots were irrelevant, and that their authority gave them a right to strip him of what was his. Meanwhile, Samuel worked his fields under the wide sky, unaware that every stroke of his hoe, every drop of sweat, was watched with envy and calculation. His land, which he saw as a sacred legacy, was now being mapped out as a commodity by those who gathered in shadows. The whispering of neighbors had grown quieter, but that was because the true conversations had moved into closed rooms. The board had shifted from complaints to plotting, from irritation to action. And so, in the quiet suburban neighborhood where appearances matter more than truth, a dangerous seed had been planted. It was not a seed Samuel had sown, yet it was one that would soon grow into the greatest challenge of his life. For in the shadows of manicured lawns and painted fences, the HOA had chosen its prey, and it would not stop until Samuel's land and everything it stood for was theirs. The first letter came folded neatly in an envelope with the HOA's embossed logo on the corner. Samuel noticed it sticking out his mailbox one cool morning as he walked down his driveway, coffee in hand. He opened it with little interest, expecting another petty notice about his fence or the angle of his barn roof. Instead, he found several pages printed with legal jargon that seemed deliberately confusing. Words like compliance violation, property assessment adjustment, and community equity clause leapt out at him. He read it twice, brow furrowed, trying to make sense of what they were demanding. According to the letter, he owed a series of fines for nonconformity with community standards. The total amount was several $1,000s, more than any previous notice had claimed. Ridiculous, Samuel muttered under his breath, folding the papers back into the envelope. He tossed it onto the kitchen table later, intending to look over it again when his mind was clearer. Yet as the day went on, another letter arrived, and another the following week. Each was worded slightly differently, but they all carried the same implication. Samuel was falling behind, and his property was becoming a liability in the eyes of the HOA. At the next HOA board meeting, behind closed doors, the stack of notices Samuel received was mirrored by an entirely different set of papers on their table. Mr. Hastings, the retired lawyer, spread out documents he had been carefully drafting. Unlike the official letters sent to Samuel, these were far more sinister. "Here we are," Hastings said with quiet satisfaction, pointing to a section on one of the forms. "This is the first step toward establishing his noncompliance as grounds for intervention. If he doesn't pay the fines, which we know he won't, we can argue breach of contract. That opens a door for us to enforce a lien." Mrs. Ellison leaned over to look, her eyes gleaming. "And once a lien is on the property, the rest falls into place." Cartwright smirked. He won't see it coming. Too proud to consult a lawyer, too stubborn to bend. He'll think these notices are just nuisances until it's too late. Their voices carried a tone of smugness, like predators circling an animal too slow to notice the danger. What they failed to acknowledge was that their scheme wasn't simply about rules or property. It was about stripping a man of his legacy, reducing generations of sacrifice into numbers on a page. Back at the farm, Samuel sat at his table one evening, letters spread out in front of him. He traced the printed words with his callous fingers, frustration tightening his chest. He was no stranger to hard work or solving problems. But this was different. The language twisted itself into knots, designed to confuse rather than clarify. He thought about calling someone for help, maybe an attorney or an old friend with legal experience. But deep down, Samuel's pride held him back. He had always handled his own affairs, always found a way through. Admitting that these papers were beyond him felt like surrender. Instead, he placed the notices in a folder and set it aside. "I'll figure it out," he told himself. "It's just more of their nonsense. Nothing I can't handle." But unease tugged at him. He could feel something shifting, though he couldn't yet see the shape of the threat. Weeks passed, and the documents grew bolder. A notice came marked final warning, its tone more severe. Another arrived with a reference to potential property action. Samuel's jaw tightened as he read the words. He still didn't understand exactly what they meant, but the threat lingered in every sentence. In the HOA's private circle, however, the tone was celebratory. Hastings presented forged paperwork that mimicked Samuel's supposed acknowledgement of the fines. It was signed with a shaky scrawl, one that barely resembled his signature, but the board didn't care. To them, it was enough. "We'll file this with the county office," Hastings said confidently. "Once it's on record, it will be difficult for him to dispute. By the time he realizes, The process will already be rolling. Mrs. Ellison chuckled softly, lifting her glass of wine. To progress, she said, raising it in a mock toast. And to finally getting rid of that stubborn farmer. The others clinked glasses, their smugness echoing off the walls of the dimly lit room. They believed themselves clever, untouchable, as though their lies and forged papers were a game they were destined to win. Samuel noticed small changes in his daily life that unsettled him further. A local bank officer called him unexpectedly, asking if he was aware of recent filing connected to his land. Confused, Samuel pressed for details, but the officer hesitated, bound by policies that prevented him from sharing too much. Later, at the feed store, a neighbor mentioned hearing rumors about property issues connected to Samuel's farm. The words cut deep, though the man said them casually, as if repeating gossip. Samuel forced a smile, but inside his stomach churned. He hadn't told anyone about the notices, yet somehow whispers had already started to spread. That night, he sat on his porch staring out at the fields. The land stretched before him, dark and quiet under the moonlight, as steady and eternal as it had ever been. Yet he felt a growing distance, as if the soil itself was slipping from his grasp. He didn't know why, but he sensed something was being pulled out from under him. Meanwhile, the HOA grew bolder in their dealings. They had already reached out to a local developer, dropping hints that land might soon become available. The developer, eager for prime acreage near the growing town, expressed immediate interest. Deals were whispered over dinner tables and phone calls. Papers were drafted in back offices, all without Samuel's knowledge. By the time the next HOA meeting came, Cartwright could hardly contain his glee. The developer's ready, he said. They want to move quickly. Once the lien is processed, we'll have leverage to push a sale, and they'll pay handsomely. Mrs. Ellison leaned back with a satisfied smile. It's almost too easy. The board laughed softly among themselves, convinced that Samuel was cornered, that his silence meant defeat. None of them considered the possibility that their arrogance might unravel the very scheme they so carefully constructed. For Samuel, the days turned heavier. He tried focusing on his crops, on the rhythm of the farm, but the weight of uncertainty pressed against his mind. The folder of notices sat on his kitchen table, like a shadow he couldn't escape. Each time he passed by, he felt its presence, accusing him of ignoring what he didn't understand. One evening, he opened the folder again and spread the papers across the table. The legal terms blurred together, but certain phrases stood out: property seizure, assessment, enforcement. His heart sank. He had no idea how close the board had already come to tightening the noose. Still, something in him resisted despair. He reminded himself that this land had survived worse. His grandfather had worked it through drought. His father had defended it against encroaching city projects. Surely, he too could find a way through. Yet, in the shadows of suburban boardrooms, the signatures had already been forged, the documents filed, the betrayal cemented in ink. The morning began like any other. Samuel was out in the fields before the sun had fully risen, the earth still damp with dew, his boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. He moved with practiced rhythm, tending to the crops the way his father and grandfather once had. The land grounded him, gave him a sense of certainty even when the world seemed determined to shake that certainty loose. But that morning, his peace was interrupted when his neighbor, Thomas Miller, pulled up along the dirt road in an old pickup. Thomas wasn't the kind of man to drop by unannounced. He was steady, private, and respected boundaries, which was why the look on his face immediately set Samuel on edge. Thomas climbed out, his hat pulled low, and walked over with a folded newspaper in his hand. "Samuel," he began slowly, his voice carrying a weight Samuel hadn't heard before. "You'd better take a look at this." Samuel wiped his hands on his work shirt and accepted the paper. His eyes scanned the legal notices section, and there it was, his land, his family's legacy, listed as part of a pending property sale application. His stomach dropped. He blinked, certain he had read it wrong. But the words were unyielding, printed in stark black ink for anyone to see. "What the hell is this?" Samuel asked, his voice breaking the quiet morning air. Thomas shook his head grimly. "I don't know the details, but it's been making the rounds at the county office. Word is, the HOA is behind it. Thought you should hear it from me before it spreads further. Samuel's hands trembled as he folded the paper back. Anger surged hot in his chest, mixing with disbelief. They had gone behind his back. They weren't just finding him anymore. They were trying to take what was his. That evening, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with the newspaper spread before him, the notices from the HOA piled up beside it. His mind replayed every moment of the last few months. The letters, the vague threats, the whispers he'd overheard in town. It all clicked now. This wasn't just harassment. It was a calculated plan. The betrayal cut deeper than he expected. These were his neighbors, people he had waved across fences, nodded at in passing, even helped during storms when their power went out. And yet, behind closed doors, they had schemed to strip him of his heritage. The thought made his jaw tighten. He wasn't just shocked. He was furious. His father's voice echoed in his memory. This land is who we are, Sam. You don't give it up, no matter what they throw at you. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his hands pressed against his face. For the first time, he realized how grave the situation had become. They weren't bluffing. They were moving forward, and if he didn't act, he would lose everything. The next day, he drove into town, the folded newspaper still on the passenger seat of his truck. He parked outside the modest office of Evelyn Parker, a lawyer known for taking on tough cases and standing firm against local corruption. He didn't know her personally, but had heard her reputation. Inside, Evelyn listened patiently as Samuel laid out the notices, the fines, and finally, the newspaper clipping. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the documents. "This doesn't add up," she said, her tone measured. "They're overstepping their authority, and some of these signatures." She paused, holding one of the notices up to the light. "These don't look right. Did you sign this acknowledgement of violation?" Samuel shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. I've never signed anything for them. Not once." Evelyn set the paper down, her eyes sharp. "Then this is forgery. And forgery tied to property theft is no small matter." Samuel's stomach churned. Hearing it framed that way made the betrayal even heavier. But alongside the weight of shock, he felt a surge of resolve. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who could see through the lies. Evelyn leaned forward. "If you're serious about fighting this, we'll need to gather evidence. Keep every letter, every notice. Make copies, and I'll start pulling records from the county clerk's office. We'll find out exactly what they filed and how far this has gone." When Samuel returned home, he moved with renewed purpose. He dug through drawers and boxes, pulling out every scrap of correspondence from the HOA. He organized them on his table, arranging them by date. He scribbled notes in the margins, circling words that felt misleading, underlining dates that didn't make sense. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting. He was preparing. As he worked late into the night, a storm rolled in outside. Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rumbled across the sky. And yet Samuel felt strangely steady. Each clap of thunder reminded him of his father's words. Each flash of lightning seemed to light the path forward. He would not go quietly. He would not surrender his land without a fight. Meanwhile, in another corner of the neighborhood, the HOA board congratulated themselves on their progress. They met in Cartwright's den, the same place where their plot had begun. A bottle of wine sat open on the table, glasses half filled as they poured over the papers Hastings had filed. "It's practically done," Cartwright said with smug satisfaction. "By the time he realizes, the sale will already be sealed. He doesn't stand a chance." Mrs. Ellison smirked, swirling her glass. "He's too stubborn to hire a lawyer. That pride will be his downfall." Hastings nodded confidently. "The documents are solid enough to pass casual inspection. No one's going to dig deeper unless he makes noise. And he won't." They laughed, their arrogance blinding them to the possibility that Samuel was already preparing his defense. In their eyes, the game was won. They underestimated not only his determination, but also the depth of his connection to the land. Days turned into weeks as Samuel and Evelyn quietly built their case. Evelyn uncovered discrepancies in the county filings, dates that didn't match, signatures that wavered unnaturally, documents entered without proper authorization. Each piece of evidence tightened the net around the HOA's lies. For Samuel, the process was both exhausting and empowering. He felt the weight of betrayal, but also the fire of purpose. He began keeping a journal of every interaction, every letter, every odd glance from a neighbor. The very community that once looked down on him would now witness his resolve. One evening, as he reviewed the growing stack of evidence, Thomas stopped by again. He glanced at the papers spread across the table and gave Samuel a firm nod. "You're not alone in this," Thomas said. "A few of us don't agree with what they're doing. We've kept quiet, but if this goes to court, we'll stand with you." Samuel's throat tightened. For weeks, he had felt isolated, a lone man against a faceless board. Hearing those words gave him a renewed sense of strength. The HOA wasn't just fighting him. They were fighting a legacy, a community, and a truth they couldn't bury forever. As the chapter of betrayal unfolded, Samuel's shock began to harden into something stronger. The deception ran deeper than he ever imagined, but so did his resolve. He had evidence, he had allies, and most importantly, he had history on his side. The land was more than soil and fences. It was blood, sweat, memory, and promise. And now, armed with proof of their lies, Samuel knew the battle ahead would not just be about property. It would be about justice.